Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
Spoken of only in whispers. Volume 2. Story 1. The overly wide grinning mouth is a horror cliché. It's a trope, albeit a successful one, that's wormed its way into scary stories from around the world. So ubiquitous is its inclusion that it's taken on a legendary status. It feels like something that's always been around to scare people, right? In 1844, one of the first serial killers in Connecticut began a rampage. Little was known about the killer, save for their signature technique of disfiguration. While the victims were alive, they amputated their cheeks. When the bodies were eventually found, their toothy, skeletal smiles became fodder for nightmares, rumors, and legends. The killer was never captured. Starting in 2012, local Connecticut message boards and forums started to feature messages and questions about ghosts. There's a town in Connecticut called Monroe. It is infested with hauntings. 2 cemeteries, Union and Stepney, are sites where ghosts can be found wandering between headstones and sometimes out into the road. In November 2012, there was an enormous uptick in the number of sightings, which precipitated the message board posts. Those who saw the ghosts began having nightmares. Those who read about the ghosts began having nightmares. The nightmares themselves were unique, save for one shared feature. They ended with a dreamer thinking they woke up, then seeing a white ghostly woman with devastating facial disfigurements crouching on their chests. She'll stare at them and trace her fingertips across their faces as she grins with her hideous, wide smile. It's not unusual for cultural events to shape the content of dreams. Following the release of the movie The Exorcist, it was widely reported that people were having dreams about demonic possession. These reports of the ghostly woman are likely tied to the prevalence of the scary stories I mentioned above, along with the sightings of so-called ghosts. I believed that for a little while. Then I started having the dreams. My kids and wife did too. Each night I'd watch paralyzed as the woman sat on my chest and touched my face. I'd wake from the nightmare sweating and experiencing pain in my cheeks and chin. Soon after, the kids would start to scream. Online searches for the identity of the 19th century serial killer have gone through the roof over the years, according to Google's list of trends. Other trends have started to show up too. Facial pain, difficulty swallowing, temporomandibular joint disorder symptoms, facial eczema. Maybe it's just my own paranoia, which I admit is growing by the day, but I can swear people around here are smiling more often. They're joyless smiles, but smiles nonetheless. My wife, whose stern, no-nonsense expression is legendary at the school where she teaches, now has smile lines creasing the corners of her mouth, and they're turning redder as the days, weeks, and months go by. My kids have always been relatively cheerful. Even when they're bored or tired, you can still see a spark of positivity in their eyes. That spark is gone, but their smiles are as wide as ever. Wider, maybe? The local Connecticut message boards are buzzing about a find someone made regarding the serial killer from 1844. Apparently, there was a chest from a Monroe church that had been given to the Historical Society in the 1980s. It was never opened and remained in the Historical Society basement for 30 years. The other day, on a whim, someone opened it. Contained within were the musings of an old nun, musings on positivity, on happiness, on smiles, and there were drawings of people with impossibly wide grins. A knife was found, wrapped in cloth, tucked into the corner of the chest. Underneath it was a small bag filled with the bloody fingernail clippings. This morning, before dawn, I had the dream again. She was on me. For the first time, I noticed the heavy cross around her neck. She caressed my face like she'd always done, but this time, her fingernails began to scrape and scratch against my skin. It tickled, then it hurt. It hurt very badly. I tried to struggle, but I couldn't wake up. I couldn't get her off. The sound of a blood-curdling scream exploded through my dream, and I woke up. The woman disappeared. I looked at my wife in bed next to me. She was screaming as she slept. I watched as the corners of her mouth split, and with a sickening crunch, I heard her jaw dislocate. Blood poured down the sheets as I grabbed her, tried to pull her out of bed and back into the waking world. Down the hall, I heard my kids shriek with pain. A half hour later, we arrived at the hospital. It was full of people bleeding from wounds on their cheeks. Some were worse than others. The place is overwhelmed, and I don't know what to do. Even as we bleed, we're all smiling. Story number 2. 2 years ago, I was diagnosed with melanoma, cancer. It was the most unexpected diagnosis in the world. One moment I was worried about my work, my kids, my wife, fixing the downstairs sink, reflooring the back patio. But once my diagnosis came in, everything changed. My whole perspective on what mattered changed, which was good, and it's what should happen to anyone who gets diagnosed with cancer. Options were discussed, plans were investigated, and treatments were researched. We worked with the doctor and listened to everything they had to say. With solidarity, we decided not to say anything to anyone, at least not right away. They were still conducting tests to verify how serious it was and to determine the exact stage. It was beyond superficial, they said, but they still needed to determine other factors. So we waited until we knew exactly what we were facing. Beth was more scared than I was, which was understandable. No matter what, she was going to have to step in and take charge of the family. Whether I passed away or was too weak from treatments, she would have to take care of both me and our 2 kids, plus work and income. Our parents offered to help as much as they could, but I knew that my parents weren't very well off, money-wise or time-wise. They both worked full-time to pay the almost complete mortgage and take care of the house, which was falling apart. I had no idea about her parents' situation. Then came the worst day of Beth's life and the second worst day of mine, the full diagnosis. The doctors spent months treating me while poking and prodding my body with tests. They had come to a complete consensus. I would die within the next year. The cancer had spread too far for me to ever truly recover. They could prolong my life with treatments, maybe even beyond that year mark, but not much. I was going to die, and no amount of money, begging, or crying could stop it. Beth and I had a fight that day. I knew I shouldn't have voiced my opinion, but I did anyway. I suggested that we not spend another dime on treatment. Let the inevitable happen, and keep me comfortable. I don't want you to be drowning in debt after I pass. Beth refused, said I was being irrational, and that we should spend every penny we had to prolong my life as long as possible. I'm religious, and she is not, if that's any explanation. It was a nasty fight. We made up when she woke up sobbing, and I had to hold her. I agreed to pay for treatment to extend my life. After all, she would suffer more than I would. I could give her more time, at the very least. That's not the horror portion of the story. If it was, countless others could post here about it. No, the cancer brought the family out of the woodworks. Everyone messaging us on Facebook, apologizing for my condition and giving empty promises to help. Apparently, our parents had let the news slip. I ended up stopping my access to Facebook. There was no reason to see that every day. I started treatment, which made me weaker and more irritable each time. I hated watching myself snap at Beth over something so simple. I couldn't help it, and I could only watch from the inside my mind as her soul was crushed. I regretted allowing her to spend money on treatment. The worst day of my life happened when Beth brought me breakfast in bed. One of the boys had left his toy cars on the floor, and she slipped. The tray emptied right into my lap along with the kettle of coffee. I screamed and yelled and cursed. I said things that I regretted every night. Beth cried for days because of my anger. The worst day of my life was when Beth started to resent me. It was a visible change ever since I yelled. Everything had been building, and that argument had broken the dam. She barely smiled and didn't look me in the eyes often. I wasted away in bed, paying for treatment that only prolonged the inevitable. Again, this isn't the horror of the story. Yes, it's terrible, but my papa's story is the real horror. He showed up at the house completely unannounced. He was over 90 and still walking around. He had to take a taxi anywhere or convince a family member to take him away from the old folks' home. But he was relatively functional. Beth showed him to my room and left us alone. She didn't stay in the room for very long nowadays. "I hear you're going to beat me to the grave," Papa smiled. His hand, shaking with age, fell over one of mine. His skin felt like thin leather, clinging to a skeleton by mere threads. The skin on his arms hung from him like deflated balloons. I wondered if my body would get to that point. What would my body look like when I was dead? "I just might," I weakly joked back. "Hope you're ready to be a pallbearer." He laughed loudly at that. Two people who knew they were close to death making jokes about it as if it were nothing. It felt good. For once in my life, I felt a kinship with my grandpa. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, pulling up the rocking chair that Beth used to use for rocking the kids to sleep. "Weak, but that's every day," I said. "You're still up and going, though?" "Yes, I fear the day that I become bedridden," he said quietly. His eyes wandered for a few minutes. I didn't say anything. We just sat there, the seconds leading us towards death passing painfully by. "I have a favor to ask," he said at last. Papa's gaze moved slowly from the window as if he had to force himself to look at me. "That's new. Usually people ask if I need anything." "Yes, well, I'm old and can't afford to not be blunt." That took me back to my argument with Beth. I'd been blunt. I could afford to soften my words. It would be worth it. "What's the favor?" I swallowed. His hand remained on mine and clenched slightly when he spoke. "It's an odd request. I should prequel it with a story, or would you rather hear the nature of the favor?" "I want to hear the favor first," I prodded, feeling slightly annoyed that he kept dragging it out. "I want you to be cremated," he blurted. My mouth dropped open. "What?" "I'm a Catholic, and cremation had come up, but I'd always firmly declined. Burial was sacred." "I want you to be cremated," he said, again with different emphasis. "But it's against the church," I started. "No, it isn't. Since the 60s, they've allowed cremation, so long as you follow certain rules. I know how devout you are, so I checked." I stared at him in bewilderment. I was too shocked to tell him to leave. In my silence, he continued. "You will be cremated, placed in an urn with all of your ashes in one place, and I've purchased a spot for you in a cemetery, back in Cebu, my hometown. You'll be next to my wife and eventually me. I've purchased spots for all of the kids and their children." I remembered my fight with Beth and chose to swallow my shouts, my teeth clenched automatically. "I want to be buried properly. I had to swallow and clear my throat. "I don't want to screw up my chances at heaven. I've checked with the church and made sure that it will be within the rules. Your ashes won't be scattered, and they'll be left in a holy place. It will be just like you're buried." "Then why?" "That's the story portion," he said quietly. Papa turned towards the door to make sure it was still shut. "Do you remember your grandmother, Mama?" I lowered my head, feeling embarrassed to talk about his dead wife, my dead grandma. "Bits and pieces," I admitted. He nodded. "You were 8 when she passed. It's understandable that you don't remember much about her. She died from a heart attack during dinner one night. Very sudden, no signs or symptoms. The ambulance rushed her to the hospital, and that's where she passed. I was devastated. So sudden. I remember thinking, she can't die. I bought tickets to the Lion King for next month. I was in absolute shock. That depressed me. Papa, I'm so sorry, I said, squeezing his hand, which remained on top of mine. His head bobbed a little in acknowledgement. Took all of 3 days to get everything settled. The funeral planning was terrible. The speech was terrible. And even the people were terrible. Very few understood. Only one of my friends had a deceased spouse, so none of them truly understood. I was alone. After we buried her, I moped around the house for a few days, completely unsure of what I was going to do. I couldn't even wash the dishes without wondering what the point was. I was in a dark and terrible place, Joseph. I stared at my hands, taking deep breaths so I wouldn't cry. My legs were starting to cramp up again, so I adjusted. Papa helped me. Once I was settled, he continued. It was night 4 days after we buried Melinda. I was lying awake in bed when I heard the front door open. I didn't even bother to get up. If a burglar was coming to steal my things, let them. If they planned to kill me too, I was okay with that. I heard them come in. I leaned forward, heart pounding. I opened my eyes when I felt a light kiss on my cheek. Joseph, she was there. Melinda had come home to me. I found myself scrambling to get off the bed while she stood there watching me. She stood perfectly still, and her eyes were bright and intelligent. The last time I had seen her eyes, they'd been empty, dead. Now they were alive with brilliant color and intelligence. I yelled her name. I ran around the bed to see her. He stopped for a moment to wipe his eyes. It was a ghost, I thought automatically. And then we embraced, he continued. My eyes narrowed in disbelief. At first I thought she was a spirit, a ghost. Papa said, echoing my thoughts, but she was physically there. I hugged her and kissed her, and she did the same back. She was there, Joseph. She didn't say a word, and she didn't have to. We made it to the bed, and I was just so excited to see her. I won't specify details for your sake, but she came back. He looked up to find my furrowed brows and confused expression. What I'm telling you is very, very real, he urged. I am not making this up, and I did not imagine it. I have proof. Show me, I said skeptically. At the end I will, he assured me. When I woke up, I expected her to be gone. I expected her to be just a figment of my imagination, a specter in physical form, but she was there in the bed with me, watching me. The excitement overcame me again. She happily embraced me yet again. I have never felt as happy as in that moment. The moment after you lose your life, then get it back again. Unfortunately, it was only temporary. He sighed. I tried asking her what had happened. I reminded her that I had buried her and asked how she had gotten out, how she had made it home. She wouldn't answer, just stared at me with the happiest expression. It was as if she didn't hear a word I said. I went to the cemetery that day and brought her with me. My logic began to take hold once again, and I came up with answers. Perhaps we had buried the wrong body. Perhaps she had never died in the hospital in the first place. Perhaps it was someone else's wife buried under Melinda's name. I spoke with the director of the cemetery and introduced him to my wife. He hadn't seen my wife's body, nor been at the funeral, so he had no idea what she looked like. But he was absolutely skeptical. I told him that someone else's family member was buried in her grave, but he told me that it was impossible. I urged him to dig up the casket and determine who was really buried there, but he refused. I got angry and yelled, trying to reiterate my point, but he shook his head and told us there was nothing he could do. I left feeling very angry. Strangely, I was more upset that someone else was missing their family member's body than anything else. Melinda tried to comfort me while I drove home. I refused to drop it, though. Your mother happened to call to check up on me. The phone rang soon after we had arrived home. I told her the amazing news, but naturally she didn't believe me either. I told her to drive over and see for herself. At the time I was living up at the old, what's it called, you remember? The house with a half staircase? I nodded, remembering it, and suddenly very interested that there might be a way to confirm his story through my mom. She made the drive while I made dinner. When she arrived, she couldn't get out of the car. The door wasn't broken or anything, she just stopped. I I saw her eyes meet Melinda's, and she couldn't even bring herself to open the door because she was so overwhelmed. It's understandable, after just burying your own mother. She didn't even come inside. She told me to get in the car and come with her. I started to and brought Melinda, but she backed up instead and drove away. I was confused, but chalked it up to her grief. She called a minute later while she drove and told me to leave without Melinda. I asked her what was wrong, but she refused to say. I told her to please come home and that Melinda missed her, but she hung up. The whole time Melinda stroked my back as if she were comforting me for the grief from her death. She smiled when I tried to tell her that her own daughter wouldn't come by. I thought that meant that she understood. Papa took a break, swallowing and taking deep breaths. His lungs were tired from talking. I could tell. Mine got the same way after a while. "You need some water?" I asked. He shook his head. I got all of 3 days with Melinda. We stayed at home and I cooked all her favorite meals. I thought that the heart attack had killed her appetite because she didn't eat anything. No amount of questions would get her to speak to me. It began to be concerning that she wouldn't speak. I remember thinking she didn't have a seizure or an aneurysm, so why isn't she talking? I wondered if her brain was broken somehow or if she was simply choosing not to speak. I got a doctor's appointment but never got to take her there. "Did she die again?" I asked cautiously. He sighed. "Your father came over 3 days after your mother had come and left. He caught me while I was gardening. Melinda was inside reading a book. He startled me because he left his car on the road and walked down the driveway. He said we needed to talk, and I stood up to brush myself off. Your father told me to come with him because there was something he needed to show me. I told him to give me a minute to get my proper shoes and bring Melinda along. I was terrified to leave her alone for too long, as you can understand. Instead of explaining, your father grabbed me by the wrist and practically dragged me to the car. I didn't yell or really fight. I was just confused. He buckled me in and we drove off. I remember that he was driving rather erratically, watching the rearview mirror every few seconds. He looked anxious, but wouldn't reply when I asked what was wrong. We pulled into the cemetery, and I understood that this was about Melinda. You would think that after only one visit that I wouldn't remember where her grave was, but I knew exactly where he would stop. There were 4 people standing around her grave. Arthur led me out of the car and over to the group. The group consisted of 2 policemen, the cemetery director, and your mother. It wasn't until I got closer and they stepped aside that I saw it. Melinda's casket had been raised out of the ground, and a pile of freshly moved dirt was piled beside the hole. "You're Mr. Bradley Duncan?" the cemetery director asked as we approached. "Yes, I met you a few days ago," I commented. He nodded. "You took my advice, I see. Who was buried?" Everyone felt uncomfortably silent. Your mother stared at the ground. Your father watched her with worry. "No one was," the director said at last. "I got confused and pushed my way around them all. I got to the other side of the grave and lifted the lid on the casket, empty. The pillow was still there, but the casket seemed unused except for some crumbs of dirt that had made their way inside." "I don't understand," I started, repeating while I dropped the lid. This time, one of the police officers stepped forward. He told me that the grave had been found that morning with the dirt in a pile and a shovel next to it. The grave had been slightly ajar and with a bit of dirt inside. He asked through a thinly veiled question if I knew anything about it. The question veiled an accusation. It couldn't have been me, I assured them, because Melinda had been home for several days. She would attest that I had not left last night and that I was home all morning. The officers pointed out my dirty clothes, to which I replied that I had been gardening. Arthur, to his credit, confirmed that I had been gardening when I arrived. The most heartbreaking moment was when your mother, trying not to cry, asked me to point blank if I had dug up her mother's body and taken it. That was when I realized what they thought I'd done. I told them that I could prove that Melinda had never even been buried. I could prove that she was alive and well. As a caravan, we drove back to my home. Arthur and your mother in the car with me and a police cruiser following behind. Your mother and father kept exchanging looks, and I tried to understand what was going on. "Laurel, honey, you saw your mother. She was never buried. She's alive, I urged. She refused to answer, just clenched her jaw. We pulled into the driveway and everyone got out. I was told to stay outside with one of the officers, while the other officer checked the house. Your mother and father were also told to stay outside. We waited for a while before the first officer returned. He said that no one was home. I expressed my confusion and raced into the house. Arthur and your mother followed me out of concern. The officers went in behind as well. Melinda must have turned out all the lights and shut all the blinds, because it was extremely dark inside. We advanced out of the door's entrance and into the living room. Fingers on the back of my neck startled me, and I about jumped out of my skin. When I spun around, it was your mother. She hissed for me to turn back around so she could see. Someone turned on the hallway light, and she poked at my neck. She asked Arthur to take a look, and he sucked in a deep breath. I asked what was wrong, but was interrupted by something falling over down the hall. In the bedroom, I saw the officer that had stayed outside exchange a look with the first officer. The one who had entered the house assured the other that no one had been home. I remember saying very confidently, "Relax, everyone. I told you Melinda's home." That's when everything turned to hell. A figure dashed out of the bedroom, but on their hands and feet like an animal. Everyone was yelling as it sped towards us down the hallway. The single light above it obscured its face in shadow and made its movement look unnatural. I heard a hiss, and then my ears exploded. It took me a moment to realize that both of the officers had begun firing at the thing. It recoiled, but only for a second. I saw the cops yell something, using a free hand to push all of us back. I tried to scream at them to stop firing because they might hit Melinda, but I knew right then that I was in the wrong, and I'd been in the wrong the whole time. For those first few intense seconds, I thought someone or something else had broken into the house, but another full glance at the thing crawling towards us told me that it was Melinda. It was, and it wasn't. The gunshots didn't do anything. There weren't even holes on her body. I fell over the couch and ended up rolling onto the floor. Your mother screamed and tried to help me up. The two cops formed a barrier between us and it. Your father had somehow disappeared. Everyone was yelling, but my ears were still ringing, and suddenly, out of the kitchen, your dad jumped through the doorway and landed on Melinda. I saw her mouth open, and she spun her head around to see what had grabbed her. That's when I saw the fangs. 2-foot-long fangs that changed from teeth into needle points. Like a saber-toothed tiger, time froze for me in that instant as I saw Melinda for what she now was. Time continued when Arthur plunged the steak knife into her back. The result was instantaneous. I remember thinking that he would anger it by stabbing, but instead it dropped like a corpse. The officers kept yelling, I think, and making wild motions with their free hands. Arthur stood and tripped back onto the floor and scrambled back against the front door, his back to it. Melinda didn't move. I didn't move. Arthur was the one who stood up and kicked the body, much to the policeman's fear. But it was dead. I was numb, and your mother held my hand. During the next few hours and even days, the policemen took turns throwing up. When my hearing returned, I could hear them wondering out loud what they should do. One look at Melinda's new face told everyone that it wasn't human. I still don't know how Arthur sorted it out. He spoke with the two of them for a while in the bedroom. After a few minutes, they both left. They avoided eye contact with the body as they passed. One of them caught my eye on the way out. Then the door slammed. Arthur and your mother had a talk, and I was taken to your house for the next few days. Arthur stayed at mine. On the fourth day, after everything, just when I had decided to pretend that Melinda had died on the proper day, your father came home. He passed your mother and knelt down in front of me. He said something to the effect of this: I don't understand everything, Dad. You might think that I do, but I truly don't. I made educated guesses, nothing more. I don't know what happened to your wife or how, but I think I solved the problem. He took out a small vial on a chain and handed it to me. He took a few breaths before he spoke again. These are the ashes of her heart. The rest of her is in an urn. I bought a space in your hometown to store her ashes. In a week, I'll take them there to be stored. But I left these ones for you to keep. If you don't want them, I'll put them with the rest." "I took those ashes, Joseph," Papa said, taking his hand away from mine. My palms were sweating from his story. He lifted a chain from around his neck and lifted it over his head. He set the small glass vial in my palm. It was full of black sand, but the irregular shapes and the way it clung to the glass told me that it was indeed ashes. I've held on to them ever since, and have spoken more and more to your father about what happened. He let me stare at the vial for a few minutes, processing everything. When I was done, I handed it back to him. He placed it securely around his neck again, tucking it under his shirt. When your mother came by that one day, she knew. She knew that it wasn't Melinda. I don't know how she did, and I didn't. But she did. And when she confided in Arthur, he didn't believe her. But she was so shaken up and upset that after a few days, he decided to do something about it. Something illegal. He dug up Melinda's casket and found it empty. He used my shovel to shift the blame off of him and used it as an excuse to investigate. The night he dug up her casket, he stayed up and looked for any similarities online. When he found the legend, my heritage confirmed that it must be correct. The Strigoi. Heard of it? I shook my head. The Strigoi myth comes from Romania, our home country. They're the basis for a lot of myths that go along with vampires. That's when I laughed. The whole time, he'd just been telling a story. His expression reflected hurt, and I immediately regretted laughing, but it was too late. My laughter had shut him down. Unconsciously, he buttoned his top button to further hide the ashes. "I want you to be cremated so that the myth of the Strigoi stays that way," he said, abrupt. "I'm asking you to put in your will. I have proof of what happened to your mama. I have the bites to prove it, Joseph." He sighed and stood up. "Thank you for at least listening." "Papa, wait," I said, feeling awful guilt. "I understand. You think it's just a story. I understand." He made his way to the door and opened it. I found myself suddenly weak and both unable and unwilling to protest his leave. "Just know, Joseph, that whether you tell your wife to cremate you or not, I will." He shut the door faster than I could react, and I was left alone in my room with the sun starting to set. The room felt much colder than it had before. I laid awake for hours, retelling the story in my mind. The part that stands out to me are the supposed conditions that can turn your corpse into a Strigoi. Being born early, born out of wedlock, filled with pain and regret, suicide, die, and unnatural death, to name a few. I was born early and out of wedlock. I definitely feel pain, and I know I'll regret the way I've treated Beth in these last few months. How natural is cancer in terms of ways to die? And didn't I somewhat decide to commit suicide by not paying for treatment? Maybe it's because I'm sick. Maybe it's because I'm close to passing away, especially at a younger age. Papa's story has been bouncing around in my head ever since he visited. I haven't spoken to him since, but it's been on my mind constantly. I've wondered what Beth would do if I'd returned from the grave, if I came back and just hung around her and the kids, smiling contentedly during the day and stealing her life by night. Maybe the cancer has gotten to my brain and made me paranoid. Regardless, I've told Beth. I've told her that I want to be cremated.